Every time people try to explain China with just one word, they almost always fail. If you call it a country, that feels too small. If you call it an empire, that still feels incomplete. And if you call it a civilization, that gets closer. But even that does not fully capture what China really is. Because the history of China is not just the story of a state sitting on a map. It is the story of a civilizational system that kept breaking apart without vanishing, kept being invaded without losing its cultural core, kept changing dynasties without losing the deeper belief that all these fragments somehow still belong to one larger order. While many ancient civilizations disappeared when their political centers collapsed, China did something stranger and much harder. It fell into chaos again and again, yet kept rebuilding itself around the same enormous idea that this land, no matter how broken it became, was still meant to be whole. That is what makes China so unusual in world history. Its story is not a straight line of uninterrupted greatness. It is a cycle of unification, expansion, prosperity, corruption, rebellion, collapse, division, and reunification, repeated again and again for thousands of years. And to understand how that happened, we have to go back far before emperors, before dynasties became memory, before China became a name associated with walls, palaces, silk, and power. We have to begin with the land itself. Northern China grew around the Yellow River, a river that gave life and destruction at the same time. It fed agriculture, but its floods could also erase entire communities. To the south, the Yangtze Basin offered a wetter, richer agricultural world, one that would later become essential to China's population, wealth, and food supply. Long before a unified state existed, these river systems shaped early settlements, agricultural life, and the first experiments in organizing labor, storing grain, and creating political authority on a larger scale. China did not appear as a ready-made empire. It grew out of multiple early communities, learning how to survive, build, and rule in a vast and varied landscape. From that prehistoric world, the Shang dynasty marks the point where China begins to step into clearly documented history. Under the Shang, we see something much more developed than scattered tribal communities. We see kings, ritual hierarchy, organized power, warfare, bronze technology, and one of the earliest stages of Chinese writing. Oracle bone inscriptions, carved onto turtle shells and animal bones for divination, reveal a society in which rulers were already linking political power to ritual, ancestors, and cosmic order. These inscriptions did not just ask about the future. They recorded anxieties about harvests, war, sacrifice, weather, and royal legitimacy. That means the Chinese state was already learning one of the most important skills a civilization can develop: how to connect memory, writing, ritual, and authority into one system. This was not yet China in the later imperial sense, but it was already recognizably Chinese in one crucial way. Political rule was inseparable from the idea that the ruler stood between human society and a larger cosmic order. When the Zhou overthrew the Shang, they did not simply seize the throne. They introduced one of the most influential political ideas in all of Chinese history, the mandate of heaven. This idea solved a deep problem. If rulers governed by heavenly approval, then how can one dynasty fall and another replace it? The Zhou answer was elegant and powerful. Heaven gives authority, but not forever. A ruler who becomes corrupt, cruel, or incapable can lose that mandate. And when that happens, rebellion can be interpreted not merely as treason, but as proof that the old dynasty had already lost legitimacy. This gave Chinese history a special rhythm. Power became sacred, but never untouchable. Dynasties could rise and fall violently, yet the process could still be explained as part of a moral order. That idea would echo through Chinese history for more than 2,000 years. The Zhou also deepened ritual hierarchy, aristocratic structure, and the idea of a civilized center surrounded by less civilized margins. Even after Zhou political control weakened, the mental framework they helped create remained. Over time, however, the Zhou center lost power, and China entered the long age of fragmentation known as the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods. On the surface, this was an era of endless violence, betrayal, shifting alliances, and expanding armies. But beneath the warfare, something extraordinary was happening. China was building its political mind. In a broken world, thinkers across the land asked the same urgent question: how can order be restored? The answers became some of the most important ideas in East Asian history. Confucian thinkers argued that society could only be stabilized through moral duty, hierarchy, ritual, education, and humane rule. Taoist thinkers distrusted rigid control and emphasized harmony with the natural order. Legalist thinkers, far colder and more severe, argued that people could not be trusted and that only strict laws, centralized power, and harsh rewards and punishments could restore stability. What is remarkable is that China never fully chose just one of these traditions. Instead, over time, it blended them. Confucianism provided ethics and legitimacy. Legalism provided methods of rule and discipline. Taoism provided philosophical depth and a counterweight to excessive rigidity. That combination became one of the deepest reasons Chinese civilization proved so resilient. It could be idealistic and pragmatic at the same time, moral in language, but authoritarian in structure. Out of that fractured world rose the state of Qin. Qin was not the most elegant state, nor the most admired by the older aristocratic centers of the Chinese world, but it was the most efficient. It absorbed legalist ideas more completely than its rivals, reorganized landholding, weakened hereditary aristocracy, strengthened the bureaucracy, and built a state capable of mobilizing men and resources on an enormous scale. In a world where survival depended on organization, Qin outperformed everyone else. Then it did what no other state had managed to do. In 221 BCE, Qin defeated its rivals and unified much of the Chinese world under a single centralized empire. Its ruler took a new title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. That moment was not just the victory of one kingdom over others. It marked the birth of the Chinese imperial model. For the first time, much of what we think of as China was imagined as one political world under one supreme center. Qin standardized script, currency, weights and measures, and administrative systems. It built roads and linked defensive walls in the north, laying foundations for what later became associated with the Great Wall. Everything was pushed toward uniformity because empire cannot function if every region behaves like a separate civilization. But Qin also revealed the dangers of extreme centralization. The state was powerful but brutally harsh. Labor demands were crushing, punishments severe, and the system too rigid to absorb stress after the first emperor's death. The dynasty collapsed quickly, yet the political model Qin created did not die with it. That was the deeper victory. China would never forget the idea that it was meant to be one. The Han dynasty took that hard imperial skeleton and turned it into something more stable and durable. If Qin built the machinery of empire, Han taught it how to last. The Han preserved centralization, but softened the harshest edges of Qin rule, gradually blending strong statecraft with Confucian moral language. This turned out to be one of the most successful formulas in Chinese history. Under Han rule, empire became normal. Administration deepened, territory expanded, and identity became more coherent. Even the idea of Han became so enduring that the majority ethnic group in China still carries that name today. This was also the era when China became more deeply connected to the wider world through the early Silk Road networks. Goods, ideas, religions, and diplomatic relationships flowed across Eurasia, and China became one of the major poles of the ancient world. Yet, like most great empires, the Han did not collapse from one dramatic blow. It decayed from within. Court struggles intensified, elites grew powerful, peasants suffered, and central control weakened. When major rebellions broke out, they exposed a deeper truth. The empire still looked immense, but the center was losing its grip. When Han fell in 220 CE, China once again entered division. The period after Han is often remembered through the romance of the Three Kingdoms, with its heroes, strategists, betrayals, and legendary battles. But behind that literary glow was a harsher truth. China had again become a fractured world of rival regimes competing for survival and legitimacy. This fragmentation stretched far beyond the Three Kingdoms into the Western Jin, and then the long centuries of northern and southern dynasties. Such a period could have permanently shattered a civilization, but it did not. And that is one of the most important things to understand about China. Even when split, rival states still operated within a shared civilizational horizon. They fought over who had legitimacy, but the very fact that they fought over legitimacy showed that all sides still believed there should ultimately be one center. Division was not treated as a permanent ideal. It was treated as a problem awaiting resolution. Meanwhile, China was still transforming. Buddhism spread deeply into Chinese life, thought, and art. Migration to the south accelerated the economic importance of the Yangtze region. Even in collapse, China was absorbing, changing, and rebalancing. That is why the reunification under the Sui dynasty mattered so much. The Sui did not last long, but like the Qin, they achieved something enormous in a short time. They restored the principle that one empire should govern the realm. They also developed the Grand Canal, one of the most important infrastructure projects in Chinese history, linking the political north with the economically rich south. This helped solve one of the great structural problems of Chinese empire: how to feed and connect a vast state across huge distances. The Sui exhausted themselves quickly, but they left behind a reunified world ready for greatness. That greatness arrived with the Tang dynasty. For many people, Tang China feels like one of the brightest golden ages in all of Chinese history.
Powerful,
it was powerful,
cultured,
wealthy, expansive, and astonishingly cosmopolitan. Its capital, Chang'an, was one of the greatest cities on earth, drawing merchants, monks, envoys, and travelers from across Asia. Tang China did not behave like a closed fortress. It behaved like a confident center of gravity. Its influence radiated outward into Korea, Japan, and beyond through law, writing, religion, administration, and elite culture. This was also a golden age of poetry and artistic brilliance, with names like Li Bai and Du Fu becoming permanent monuments in Chinese cultural memory. Buddhism flourished, court life dazzled, and the empire projected an image of civilizational completeness. Yet no golden age lasts forever. The Tang system weakened under internal strain, frontier military pressure, and great shocks like the An-Lushan rebellion. Though the dynasty survived afterward, it never fully recovered its earlier splendor. Once again, the old pattern returned. Great flourishing followed by weakening center and fragmentation. After another era of division came the Song dynasty, one of the most fascinating paradoxes in Chinese history. In many ways, Song China was one of the most advanced societies on earth. Commerce deepened, cities expanded, printing spread widely. Administration became highly sophisticated, and the use of gunpowder, the compass, and printing technologies became more important. This was a China of markets, literacy, technical skill, and refined culture. Yet, the Song also revealed a hard truth. A highly developed civilization is not automatically militarily dominant. The dynasty faced intense pressure from powerful northern rivals like the Liao, Western Xia, and later the Jin. Eventually, northern China was lost, and the court retreated south. Southern Song remained wealthy, productive, and culturally brilliant, but it lived under the shadow of a lost north. Song civilization glittered, but uneasily. Then came the Mongols, and the scale of the challenge changed completely. From the steppe rose an empire of terrifying mobility and destructive force that crushed kingdoms and ancient powers across Eurasia. China was not spared. After a long and brutal conquest, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271. For the first time, all of China came under a Mongol-ruled dynasty. This was a profound turning point. It proved that China could be conquered by outsiders from the frontier. Yet here, another deep Chinese pattern emerged. To rule China for long, conquerors had to enter the Chinese political world. The Mongols preserved distinctions between rulers and ruled, but they also had to govern a vast agrarian and bureaucratic civilization. In other words, China was conquered, but not erased. The outsider could seize the throne, but ruling from the throne changed the outsider. When Yuan rule weakened under unrest, fiscal stress, and dissatisfaction, a new movement rose, claiming to restore Chinese rule. That movement became the Ming dynasty. Its founder, Zhu Yuanzhang, came from humble origins, which tells us something important about Chinese history. In times of collapse, the next restorer of order does not always emerge from aristocratic ranks. Sometimes he is the hardest and most relentless survivor of chaos. The Ming presented themselves as a restoration of Chinese rule after Mongol domination. They rebuilt state structures, strengthened imperial control, and leaned heavily into Confucian political order. This was the age of the Forbidden City, of porcelain, court ritual, and an image of classical imperial China that later generations would remember vividly. It was also the era of Zheng He's great maritime expeditions across the Indian Ocean. Those voyages showed that China possessed impressive naval and logistical capacity. Yet, in the end, Ming priorities returned to internal control and northern defense. This shift makes sense when we remember that, for many Chinese dynasties, the most immediate existential threat did not lie at sea, but on the steppe frontier. The strengthening of the Great Wall under the Ming is a stone reminder of how seriously that northern danger was taken. But like previous dynasties, Ming power eventually weakened under fiscal strain, unrest, and internal decay. Once again, rebellion inside and pressure from outside collided. The next dynasty, the Qing, is one of the great ironies of Chinese history. Founded by the Manchus, an outsider people, the Qing went on to become one of the most successful and territorially expansive dynasties ever to rule China. Under emperors such as Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, the empire expanded and consolidated control over vast frontier regions such as Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia. Much of the territorial shape people associate with modern China was strongly defined under Qing rule. This matters because it breaks the simplistic idea that Chinese history is just one uninterrupted story of a single ethnic group ruling forever. China was also a multi-ethnic empire, and some of the dynasties that most strongly shaped it were founded by outsiders. But again, Qing rule survived by entering the Chinese civilizational framework rather than rejecting it. The Manchus used the Confucian bureaucracy, imperial rituals, and the language of Chinese legitimacy to govern. For a long time, Qing seemed immensely strong. Then the world changed faster than the empire did. In the 19th century, the old Chinese worldview collided violently with industrialized Western imperial powers. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had often imagined the world in terms of a civilized center surrounded by lesser powers. That worldview began to shatter when Britain and other industrial states arrived with naval firepower, global finance, and imperial ambition. The Opium Wars were a profound humiliation. China lost, ports were forced open, privileges were granted to foreign powers, and unequal treaties tore into the sovereignty of the empire. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a psychological rupture. China, long accustomed to seeing itself as a central civilization, was forced to confront the fact that the old imperial order could no longer defend itself in a rapidly changing world. Internal disaster only deepened the crisis. The Taiping Rebellion became one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. Other uprisings followed. Then Japan, once deeply influenced by Chinese civilization, modernized rapidly and defeated Qing China in war, taking Taiwan and further shattering the empire's sense of superiority. This is why later Chinese memory would frame the 19th and early 20th centuries as a century of humiliation. China was not merely weakened, it was exposed. The 1911 revolution ended more than a dynasty. It ended the imperial system itself. For over 2,000 years, dynasties had risen and fallen, but empire as a political form had survived. Now the throne itself disappeared. The Qing fell, and the Republic of China emerged with the promise of modern nationhood. This was an extraordinary rupture in Chinese history. But destroying the old order was easier than building a new one strong enough to replace it. After early republican hopes, power fragmented once more. Yuan Shikai's ambitions and later death helped push China into the warlord era. Regional military rulers gained control, the center weakened, and foreign influence continued. China was now modern in name, but fractured in practice. This was an ancient pattern, wearing modern clothes. The center had collapsed, the provinces moved, and the realm broke again. At the same time, competing ideologies fought to define China's future. nationalism, socialism, Marxism, republicanism, and various models of reform all competed to answer the question that now haunted the country. What is China if it is no longer an empire? The 20th century then subjected China to multiple catastrophes at once. Civil war between nationalists and communists, foreign invasion, state weakness, and mass suffering all collided. Japan's invasion and the broader war that followed burned themselves into Chinese historical memory with tremendous force. Cities were destroyed, civilians massacred, and the cost of national weakness made horrifyingly real. After Japan's defeat in 1945, civil war resumed between the nationalists and communists. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China on the mainland, while the Republic of China government retreated to Taiwan. This moment was framed not merely as a partisan victory, but as the end of national humiliation, fragmentation, and powerlessness. And in a deeper sense, beneath the Marxist language, it connected to something very old in Chinese history. After chaos, there must be unity. After weakness, there must be a strong center. After humiliation, there must be restoration. The Mao era remains one of the most dramatic and controversial chapters in modern Chinese history. On one hand, the communist state re-established central authority, carried out land reform, mobilized society, and built a political center capable of penetrating Chinese life more deeply than almost any previous government. After decades of fragmentation, this was a major achievement. On the other hand, the same ideological and political concentration of power produced immense disaster. The Great Leap Forward attempted to transform the economy through mass mobilization and contributed to one of the deadliest famines in human history. Later, the Cultural Revolution shattered institutions, targeted intellectual and political enemies, mobilized youth into radical campaigns, and threw the country into chaos. The tragedy of Maoist China is that the state which restored unity also unleashed forms of destruction on a national scale from above. The center became so strong that it could destabilize the entire civilization it claimed to save. Yet even after these upheavals, China did not collapse. After Mao's death, it changed direction again. Under Deng Xiaoping and the Reform-era leadership, China began one of the most pragmatic pivots in modern political history. Market reforms, special economic zones, foreign investment, and a new emphasis on growth transformed the country. This was not a full abandonment of communist political control. Instead, it was something far more unusual: economic opening under the direction of a still powerful party state. That combination changed everything. Coastal regions boomed, cities expanded, manufacturing exploded, and hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. China became the workshop of the world, and then, increasingly, more than that. But this was not just an economic miracle. It was also a psychological reversal. For many Chinese people, and for the political leadership, reform and growth were part of reversing the weakness and humiliation of the previous century. China was not only becoming richer, it was returning to history as a central actor. Then came the era of Xi Jinping, and with it another shift. When Xi rose to top leadership in 2012 and became president in 2013, China was already powerful. It was no longer a poor country trying to catch up. It was the world's second largest economy, a manufacturing giant, and a major geopolitical force. Under Xi, however, the goal was no longer simply to continue growing along the same path. The direction changed. The Communist Party was pushed back to the absolute center of political life with greater emphasis on discipline, ideology, national security, and centralized authority. The anti-corruption campaign was presented as a drive to clean up the system, but it also helped consolidate power and weaken rival networks. At the same time, China began speaking more forcefully about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, a phrase that ties the present directly to the long memory of humiliation and lost status. Externally, the Belt and Road Initiative signaled a new level of global ambition. China became more assertive in foreign policy, military modernization, technology competition, and questions of sovereignty, including around Taiwan and in surrounding seas. Yet, this era has also revealed the costs of strong centralization. The zero-COVID years showed both the power and rigidity of state control, while the economy now faces slower growth, demographic pressure, and a more difficult international environment. In the long arc of Chinese history, the Xi era looks less like a total break and more like a modern version of a very old pattern. When the world feels unstable, China strengthens the center. When external pressure rises, it speaks more intensely of national restoration. And when it becomes strong enough to think beyond survival, it starts thinking in civilizational terms again. If you had to summarize the complete history of China in one idea, it would not simply be continuous rise. That would be too simple and not really true. China has not risen in a straight line. It has broken many times. It has been conquered, divided, humiliated, revolutionized, and rebuilt. What makes it extraordinary is not that it never fell. It is that it kept returning. From the ritual bronze world of the Shang, to the mandate of heaven under the Zhou, to the first imperial unification under Qin, to the durable imperial order of Han, the cosmopolitan brilliance of Tang, the commercial sophistication of Song, the outsider rule of Yuan, the restoration of Ming, the territorial scale of Qing, the humiliation of the 19th century, the fall of empire, revolution, Mao, reform, and now Xi Jinping's era of renewed central ambition. All of these are chapters in the same larger struggle. The struggle to keep China from dissolving. The struggle to define what China actually is. And the struggle to make sure that whenever the realm breaks, it can still be imagined as one. That is why China's history feels so large. It is not just the history of rulers. It is the history of a civilization that turned unity into destiny, memory into power, and collapse into something that could always, somehow, become the beginning of another age. And maybe that is the deepest truth of all. China is not only a place with a long past, it is a civilization that has spent thousands of years refusing to let fragmentation be its final form.